The supermarket was bright in that carefully designed way meant to make people feel important. Polished floors, soft music, shelves lined with products that looked more like promises than groceries. Carts rolled past in smooth lines, scanners beeped steadily, and people spoke in low, confident voices, as if simply being there said something about who they were. My mother stood beside me in the organic produce aisle, holding a small basket against her hip. She looked around once, then smiled, the kind of smile she used when she thought she was being clever. "You're too poor to shop here," she said, loud enough for the people closest to us to hear. A woman a few steps away let out a short laugh before catching herself. A man pretended to study a label a little too closely. No one said anything. No one had to. The judgment settled into the air as naturally as the music playing overhead. I didn't respond. I didn't argue or correct her. I stood there with my hands loosely at my sides, feeling that familiar tightening in my chest. This wasn't new. It was just the first time she'd said it so openly, in a place where silence from strangers felt like agreement. I looked past her shoulder, down the long, clean aisle, at the signs hanging from the ceiling, at the way the store flowed exactly as it was meant to. And I thought, with a strange calm, she has no idea where she's standing. My name is Nicole Adams. I was 32 at the time, and if you looked at me standing next to my mother that afternoon, you probably would have believed her. I wore simple jeans, flat shoes, a plain jacket. No jewelry worth noticing, nothing that announced success. I had learned a long time ago that looking unremarkable made life quieter. To my mother, being quiet meant being ordinary. And ordinary, in her mind, was a kind of failure. She had always believed that success should be visible. If it couldn't be admired from a distance, it didn't count. She noticed clothes before character, price tags before effort. People who impressed her were people who made others look twice. People like me, who blended in, were projects that needed fixing. "Why don't you just wait by the entrance?" she added, softer now, but still sharp. "I'll be quick." She said it the way someone might tell a child to stay put, for their own good. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I knew better than to push back in public. Pushing back only ever made things worse. It turned into lectures, comparisons, long speeches about wasted potential and how appearances mattered whether I liked it or not. We moved toward the checkout line, her basket heavier now, mine nearly empty. The line was long, stretching past displays of glossy magazines and impulse buys. People stood with the relaxed patience of those who believed they belonged wherever they chose to be. My mother scrolled through her phone, already finished with the moment. For her, the comment was harmless, practical even. She had said what she believed to be true and moved on. I stayed quiet, replaying her words in my head. Too poor. It was a phrase she'd used in different forms my entire life. Too plain. Too small. Too modest. Never enough of whatever she valued that year. I watched the cashier scan items ahead of us, hands moving with practiced efficiency. The system worked smoothly, every step intentional. Nothing here was accidental. Not the layout, not the pricing, not the way the staff communicated with quick glances and subtle nods. My mother sighed when she glanced at the total on the screen ahead of us. "This place really is ridiculous," she said to no one in particular, "but you get what you pay for." I almost smiled, but stopped myself. There was a time when comments like that would have burned. Years ago, I would have felt smaller with every word, as if I needed to apologize for existing beside her. That feeling was still there, faint but familiar, like an old ache that flared up under pressure. But there was something else now, too. Something steadier. I wasn't embarrassed because I didn't belong. I was uncomfortable because she was still so certain she understood me after all these years of not asking. The line moved forward. A young employee nearby adjusted a display, then glanced up at me briefly. There was no judgment in their expression, no curiosity, just recognition, neutral and professional, before they looked away again. My mother stepped closer to the counter and placed her basket down. "Finally," she muttered. I followed, standing beside her, close enough to hear her breath change as she prepared to pay. My hand brushed the inside of my jacket pocket, and I felt the familiar edge of something smooth and rigid there. I had stayed quiet for nearly 10 years. Not because I had nothing to say, but because timing matters. We stood in line while my mother scrolled through her phone, already done with the moment she'd created. Her words lingered in my head, not like a fresh wound, but like something old that had been pressed on too many times. Too poor. It fit so easily into the space she'd carved for me over the years, that part of me almost expected it. This wasn't the first time she'd said something like that. It was just the first time she'd said it where strangers could hear. As the cart in front of us moved forward, my mind slipped backward without effort to a lifetime of being described as fine. My grades were fine, my behavior was fine, my choices were fine. Never impressive enough to boast about, never bad enough to worry over. I was the child who existed comfortably in the middle, which meant I rarely existed at all. At school events, my mother would smile politely when teachers spoke about me. "She's very steady," they'd say. "Reliable." My mother would nod, already glancing toward someone else's child, someone with trophies or louder accomplishments. On the drive home, she'd mention them casually. Not to hurt me, she'd insist later, just to motivate me. I learned early that praise was a kind of currency in our house, and I wasn't worth spending it on. She never called me a failure. That would have been easier to push against. Instead, she treated me like an unfinished draft. Something that might be worth revisiting once it had more substance. When relatives asked what I was up to, she'd answer for me. "She's figuring things out," she'd say, with a little laugh, as if adulthood were a phase I was slow to grow out of. I stopped correcting her at some point, not all at once, but gradually, the way you stop knocking on a door when no one ever answers. I noticed how every explanation turned into a comparison, how every plan became a suggestion for something better, something shinier, something she could be proud of in a way that reflected well on her. Success, to my mother, had rules. It had to be visible. It had to be recognizable to people who didn't care enough to ask questions. Clothes mattered, cars mattered, addresses mattered. If others couldn't see it immediately, it didn't count. I didn't fit into that picture, so she kept trying to adjust the frame. By my late teens, I'd learned the safest way to exist around her was quietly. I shared less, volunteered fewer details, nodded through advice I never intended to take. Silence wasn't dramatic. It didn't provoke lectures or disappointment. Silence let me breathe. There were moments I thought about pushing back. Moments when I imagined saying, "You don't see me," or "You don't know what I'm doing." But I'd seen how those conversations ended. She'd tilt her head, smile patiently, and explain why I was wrong about my own life, how she just wanted the best for me, how one day I'd understand. So I adapted. I learned to be self-contained. I stopped needing her approval because I realized how easily she could withdraw it. The line in the supermarket crept forward. A scanner beeped somewhere ahead of us, pulling me back into the present. My mother sighed as she looked up from her phone, her eyes flicking over the shelves near the register. "This place is absurd," she muttered. "Prices like these are meant for people who don't think before they spend." She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. In her mind, the comment wasn't about me directly. It was about categories, about knowing where you belonged. I watched the cashier ahead finish with the customer in front of us, their movements smooth and unhurried. Everything about the store felt intentional, from the spacing of the checkout lanes to the calm efficiency of the staff. It was designed to run without friction, without drama. My mother shifted her basket from one arm to the other. "You know," she said almost kindly, "there's nothing wrong with admitting when something isn't for you." I nodded, the gesture automatic. She mistook it for agreement. I let her. What she didn't know was how many times I'd already admitted that certain things weren't for me. Not because I couldn't reach them, but because they didn't matter. I had learned to build my life in spaces she never looked at, places where quiet competence counted more than appearances. The cashier waved the next customer forward. That would be us soon. A young employee stood nearby, adjusting a display of reusable bags. They glanced up at me briefly, their expression neutral, professional, and then looked away. There was no judgment there, no curiosity, just recognition, the kind that didn't need explanation. I wondered, not for the first time, how many parts of my life my mother had never seen simply because she hadn't been looking. As we stepped closer to the counter, I felt the familiar calm settle over me. The kind that came from knowing exactly who you were, even when the people closest to you didn't. I thought about the first job I'd ever taken, the one she'd waved off as temporary and unimportant. She'd been wrong about that too. The line moved forward another step, and while my mother studied the impulse items near the register, my mind drifted to the part of my life she had always dismissed as unimportant. The work that didn't sound impressive. The job she called temporary. The year she believed didn't count. My first real job was in a warehouse on the edge of town, a place that smelled like cardboard and diesel and stale coffee. I was barely out of school, working early mornings and late nights, lifting boxes, checking manifests, learning how products actually move from one place to another. When I told my mother about it, she wrinkled her nose and said, "That's not a career, Nicole. That's just something until you figure things out." I figured things out faster than she realized. While she focused on titles and appearances, I paid attention to systems. I learned how delays happened, where money was wasted, how a single mistake in logistics could ripple through an entire operation. I noticed which supervisors listened and which ones talked just to hear themselves. I noticed how often the people doing the most important work were the least visible. I didn't argue when my mother dismissed it. I didn't try to make it sound better than it was. I showed up on time, stayed late, and took notes, literal notes, scribbled in cheap notebooks I kept tucked into my bag. I wrote down questions. I wrote down patterns. I wrote down ideas no one had asked for yet. I moved from the warehouse floor into coordination roles, then into supply planning. Each step was quiet. No announcements, no congratulations. Just more responsibility and a deeper understanding of how fragile efficiency really was. How much trust mattered in retail, how quickly things fell apart when people felt disposable. Once I tried to explain my work to my mother over dinner. I was proud of a small process improvement I'd helped implement, something that saved time and reduced waste. She listened for a minute before interrupting to ask if I'd thought about dressing more professionally if I wanted to move up. That was the last time I tried to translate my life into terms she respected. After that, I stopped explaining. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. Every explanation turned into advice I hadn't asked for. Every success became something she reframed as luck or timing. It was easier to let her believe what she wanted and keep my focus where it belonged. The truth was, I was building something long before it had a name. I saw how traditional grocery models squeezed workers and customers at the same time. How prices rose while quality dropped. How executives talked about margins without ever setting foot on the floor. I started to imagine a different approach, one that treated employees like assets instead of expenses and customers like people instead of data points. The first time I shared that idea with a colleague, he laughed. "You're thinking too small," he said, glancing past me as if someone more important might appear. "Or too idealistic. This industry doesn't work that way." I smiled and let him underestimate me. I'd learned by then that dismissal was often an advantage. That wasn't the only time it happened. Suppliers assumed I was support staff. Junior executives spoke over me in meetings. People explained my own proposals back to me as if they were doing me a favor. Each time, I listened. Each time, I learned exactly where their blind spots were. Back in the supermarket, I looked down a long aisle lined with neatly stacked shelves. Everything was spaced just right, labels facing forward, prices clear but not aggressive. The store ran the way it did because someone had thought through every detail, every flow, every human interaction. My mother commented on a brand she liked, complaining about how expensive it was but placing it in her basket anyway. She didn't notice the efficiency. She didn't notice the design. She noticed what she always noticed, the numbers on the tags. I stood there, feeling the strange overlap of past and present. All those early mornings, all those overlooked roles, all those conversations where I'd been talked past, they were reflected here in ways she couldn't see. The irony settled over me gently, not bitter, just steady. I hadn't built my life to impress her. Somewhere along the way, that stopped being the point. I'd built it so I wouldn't need permission to take up space, so I wouldn't have to perform success in a way that satisfied someone else's fears. The conveyor belt hummed as it carried items toward the scanner. My mother stepped closer to the counter, confident and relaxed, certain of her place in the world. She still believed she understood me, that I was standing beside her as an accessory, not an equal. I followed her, calm settling into my bones. There was no rush now, no urge to correct her assumptions. I knew what was coming, even if she didn't. As she placed the last item on the belt, I thought about the moment I'd realized I didn't want just one store, one role, one quiet win. I wanted a system that worked differently, that proved dignity and efficiency didn't have to be opposites. The cashier looked up, ready for the next customer. That would be us. Silence had never meant weakness to me, even though that was how my mother interpreted it. Standing beside her in the checkout line, I understood something with a clarity that surprised me. I hadn't stayed quiet all these years because I lacked confidence. I had stayed quiet because I didn't need to convince anyone who was determined not to listen. She shifted her basket onto the counter with the ease of someone who assumed the world would adjust around her. I watched her movements, familiar and assured, and thought about all the times I could have corrected her assumptions. I could have mentioned promotions, projects, responsibilities. I could have dropped titles into conversation and watched her recalibrate, but I knew how those conversations went. Facts turned into debates. Achievements turned into questions. Nothing was ever enough unless it fit neatly into her idea of success. So I stopped offering explanations. At first, the distance felt uncomfortable, like leaving a room before the conversation was finished. But over time, it became a kind of relief. My life didn't need to pass her inspection to be valid. I learned to protect the parts of myself that mattered by keeping them out of reach of her judgment. I stopped inviting her into my world. I didn't tell her about new projects or late nights spent solving problems no one else wanted to touch. I didn't mention meetings where my opinion shifted outcomes or decisions that affected dozens of people. When she asked vague questions, I gave vague answers, not to punish her, but to preserve myself. There were other people who saw me clearly. Managers who asked what I thought and waited for the answer. Colleagues who trusted me with responsibility instead of assumptions. A mentor who once told me, quietly, that competence had a way of making noise eventually, whether you advertised it or not. With them, I didn't have to perform. I just had to show up and do the work. That contrast sharpened everything. Around my mother, I was something unfinished, always needing improvement. Everywhere else, I was trusted, valued, measured by results instead of appearances. I began to understand that recognition only felt good when it came from people who actually knew you. Back in the supermarket, my mother leaned slightly toward the cashier as the first items were scanned. "I swear prices go up every time I come here," she said, with a light laugh meant to invite agreement. Someone behind us smiled politely. The cashier nodded without responding. She glanced at me, a quick look that carried a familiar message. "See? This place isn't for people like us." I kept my expression neutral. The moment didn't sting the way it once would have. It felt more like watching someone repeat an old line after the meaning had drained out of it. I noticed a manager a few lanes over, their attention moving easily across the registers. When their eyes passed over me, there was a brief pause. Not surprise, recognition. Subtle, professional, gone in an instant. They resumed their scan of the floor, but the shift lingered in the air. My mother didn't notice. She was too busy enjoying her certainty. The cashier paused briefly, fingers hovering over the scanner as if waiting for something. My mother cleared her throat. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone tipping toward impatience. "Yes, ma'am," the cashier replied, glancing once more in my direction before continuing. The items moved along the belt again. That small hesitation tightened something inside me, not anxiety, awareness, the sense that the balance was changing, quietly but decisively. My mother placed her wallet on the counter, already prepared to pay. "Next time," she said to me, almost kindly, "you should just tell me if something's out of your budget. There's no shame in that." I nodded again, the gesture automatic. She mistook it for agreement. What she didn't see was the way my calm had sharpened. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about being reduced over and over to a version of myself that fit her comfort. The line behind us grew still. Conversation softened. The steady rhythm of scanning slowed. I stepped a little closer to the counter, close enough that the cashier's eyes flicked to mine and stayed there this time. My mother frowned slightly. "You don't have to crowd me," she said. "I've got it." "I know," I replied, my voice even. I could feel the edge of my name badge against my fingers inside my jacket pocket. The familiar weight of it grounded me, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. I hadn't planned this moment. I hadn't rehearsed it. But some moments didn't wait for preparation. Silence settled around us, heavier than before. The cashier finished scanning the last item and looked up, their question unspoken but clear. I took a slow breath, not to steady myself, but to mark the end of something I'd carried for a long time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The checkout line felt different now, like a narrow stage where every movement carried weight. The conveyor belt crept forward, and each scanned item landed with a soft thud that echoed louder than it should have. I became aware of how close everyone stood, how little space there was to disappear. My mother continued as if nothing had shifted. She commented on the prices, on the selection, on how certain things were clearly meant for a different kind of shopper. Her tone was casual, practiced, the way people speak when they believe the room belongs to them. A couple behind us smiled politely. Someone else looked away. No one challenged her. The cashier scanned another item and hesitated, just for a second. It was subtle enough that my mother missed it, but I didn't. The cashier's eyes flicked toward me, then back to the screen, fingers hovering before resuming. The pause sent a quiet ripple through my chest. Not nerves, confirmation. My mother noticed the slowdown and sighed. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice edging toward impatience. "We're kind of in a hurry." "No, ma'am," the cashier said quickly. "Just one moment." The words hung there, unfinished. My mother rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath about service standards. She leaned closer to the counter, reclaiming the space with her body language. To her, this was still her moment, her transaction, her authority. I stood just behind her shoulder, watching the way people deferred without thinking. I could still step back. I could still let the moment pass. Silence was familiar. Silence had kept things smooth for years, but silence had also taught her that there were no consequences. I felt the decision settle, quiet and solid. This wasn't about correcting her or proving anything to the strangers around us. It was about refusing to accept the version of myself she kept offering to the world. I stepped forward until I was standing beside her, close enough that the cashier's attention shifted fully to me. The cashier straightened, relief flickering across their face. A manager moved closer from a neighboring lane, their approach unhurried but intentional. My mother glanced at me, irritation tightening her mouth. "You don't need to stand so close," she said. "I'm paying." "I know," I replied again. She huffed softly, turning back to the counter. "Some people just don't understand how places like this work," she said, half to the cashier, half to the air. "You have to be realistic about what you can afford." The words landed heavier than the ones before. The line behind us went quiet, as if people sensed something was about to break. Even the music overhead seemed to fade. The cashier scanned the last item and looked up, waiting. The manager stopped a few steps away, hands clasped in front of them. My mother pulled out her wallet, already reaching for her card. I didn't rush. I didn't interrupt. I let the moment stretch just long enough for the shape of it to change. Years of being talked over, corrected, minimized, compressed into a single clear choice. I reached into my jacket pocket and wrapped my fingers around the edge of my name badge. The plastic was cool and familiar against my skin. I felt oddly calm, like I had stepped into a space I'd been preparing for without realizing it. My mother noticed the movement and frowned. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp with annoyance. I met her eyes for the first time since we'd joined the line, not defensively, not challengingly, just steadily. The irritation on her face faltered, replaced by confusion. The cashier's gaze stayed on me, expectant. The manager shifted their weight slightly, ready. I took my hand out of my pocket, but didn't reveal anything yet. Not because I was hesitating, but because I wanted her to feel the pause. To sit, just for a second, in not knowing. For most of my life, she had been the one with answers, the one who explained who I was and where I belonged. In this moment, she had none. The receipt printer whirred softly, waiting for a command that hadn't been given. The silence grew thick enough to press against my ears. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't change my expression. I simply stood there, no longer behind her, no longer beside her, but squarely in my own place. My fingers tightened around the badge, and I knew there was no going back to the way things had been. Not after this. The cashier finished scanning the last item and looked up, not at my mother, but at me. The moment stretched, thin and quiet, like the air before a storm breaks. The beeping stopped. The conveyor belt went still. Even the people behind us seemed to sense that something had shifted. I stepped forward, closing the small gap between myself and the counter. "It's okay," I said calmly, my voice steady. I addressed the cashier by name, the way I always did, and felt their shoulders relax almost imperceptibly. That was when my mother finally turned to look at me, irritation already forming on her face. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm paying." I reached into my jacket and took out my name badge, holding it where it could be seen clearly. The plastic caught the overhead light for a moment before settling. Nicole Adams, founder and owner. "This is my store," I said quietly. "Welcome to my supermarket." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The silence that followed was heavier than any reaction could have been. My mother froze, not dramatically, not with a gasp or a sharp intake of breath. She simply stopped moving, her hand still hovering over her open wallet. Her eyes dropped to the badge, then lifted back to my face, searching for something that would tell her this was a joke. It wasn't. The manager stepped forward immediately, their tone professional and warm. "Good afternoon, Miss Adams," they said. "Would you like me to take care of this?" "Yes, thank you," I replied just as evenly. The cashier straightened, confidence replacing uncertainty, and waited for my instruction. Around us, the world realigned itself without a sound. Authority shifted. Recognition settled into place. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. Her gaze darted around, taking in the staff, the checkout, the people nearby who had gone so quiet. The laughter from earlier was gone. The certainty she'd carried moments ago drained from her posture, leaving something unsteady behind. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice lower than before. I turned to face her fully then, not with anger, not with triumph, just with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. "I was never poor," I said. "I just didn't live the way you used to measure people." She flinched as if I'd struck her, though I hadn't raised my voice at all. The sentence landed because it was true, and because she knew it. I didn't list accomplishments. I didn't explain timelines or sacrifices. I didn't tell her how many stores there were, or how long it had taken, or what it had cost me. None of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was that the version of me she'd been so confident about no longer existed. The receipt printer hummed back to life. The manager handled the transaction smoothly, asking a procedural question that I answered without thinking. The cashier nodded and followed instructions, professionalism restored. The system continued, exactly as it was designed to do. My mother stood there, watching it all happen around her, no longer the center of the interaction. Her shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of what she'd said pressing down now that there was no room left to deny it. "I didn't know," she murmured, almost to herself. "I know," I replied. For the first time, the words weren't an apology. They were an acknowledgement. No one clapped. No one whispered. The people behind us shifted and began to talk again, the spell broken. To them, it was just another checkout line, another transaction completed. They returned to their carts and lists and phones, already moving on. For my mother and me, the damage and the truth remained. The manager handed me the receipt and asked if there was anything else I needed. "No," I said. "That's all." I stepped back slightly, giving my mother space. She looked at the bags, then at me, then down at her hands. The authority she'd relied on for so long had vanished, replaced by a fragile uncertainty she didn't know how to carry. I didn't take pleasure in that. I didn't rush to fill the silence either. The truth was out now. It stood between us, solid and undeniable. What came next would decide whether anything changed at all. The receipt slid across the counter, and the cashier handed it to me with the same calm professionalism they offered every customer. The people behind us began to move again, carts rolling forward, conversations restarting in low murmurs. For the store, the moment was already over. For us, it wasn't. My mother stood very still, her bags resting at her feet, as if she wasn't sure whether she was supposed to pick them up. The confidence she'd carried through the aisles had cracked, not loudly, but enough to let something uncertain show through. She looked at me, then away, then back again. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. The question came out softer than I expected, but it wasn't an apology. It wasn't even regret. It was confusion, edged with defensiveness. The same tone she'd used my whole life when something didn't fit her understanding of the world. I didn't answer right away. We stepped a few feet to the side, out of the main flow of traffic, but still very much in public. A manager lingered nearby, ready to intervene if needed, but I shook my head slightly. This didn't need privacy. It needed honesty. Every time I tried to tell you about my life, I said finally, it turned into something I had to justify, or fix, or make smaller, so it didn't make you uncomfortable. She frowned. I was only trying to help you. You know that. I know that's what you tell yourself, I replied. My voice stayed calm, even. But help that comes with humiliation isn't help, and love that needs me to stay small isn't love I can accept anymore. Her mouth opened as if to argue, then closed again. She adjusted her grip on one of the bags, the paper crinkling under her fingers. I just wanted you to have more, she said. I didn't want you to struggle. I nodded. I understand that. But you decided what more looked like without ever asking me what I wanted. And when I didn't match your picture, you treated me like I was lacking. That landed harder than anything I'd said before. She looked down, then back up, her eyes scanning my face as if trying to reconcile two versions of me at once. The daughter she thought she knew, and the woman standing in front of her now. So what now? She asked, her voice quieter. I took a slow breath. This was the part that mattered. Now I stopped letting you talk to me like that. No jokes about money, no comments about where I belong, not in public, not in private. If that happens again, I won't stay. Her brows drew together. You'd just walk away? Yes, I said. I already know how to do that. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It wasn't dramatic either. It was the kind of pause where something old is deciding whether it can survive a new reality. My mother looked at me. Really looked, perhaps for the first time, without the filter of her expectations. She didn't apologize. Not yet. Instead, she nodded once, stiffly, as if acknowledging a rule she didn't like but couldn't ignore. I didn't realize how far I'd gone, she said after a moment. The words were tentative, unpolished. I thought I was motivating you. I know, I replied, but motivation that comes from shame leaves damage behind. She didn't answer. Her gaze drifted toward the exit, then back to me. I watched her carefully, not waiting for validation, just observing. I wasn't trying to win anything here. I was setting a line and seeing if she recognized it. Around us, the store hummed on. Employees moved between aisles. A child laughed somewhere near the bakery. Life continued, indifferent to our reckoning. My mother picked up her bags at last. I need to go, she said. I know. She hesitated, then asked, almost awkwardly, will you come by sometime for dinner? It wasn't a promise. It wasn't an apology. It was an opening, small and uncertain. Maybe, I said, if we can talk without putting each other down. She nodded again, more slowly this time. I'll try. That was all she could offer. And for once, it was enough. As she turned toward the exit, I felt something inside me loosen. Not because she'd changed in an instant, but because I had. I wasn't chasing her understanding anymore. I wasn't shrinking to keep the peace. The truth hadn't fixed us, but it had stopped me from disappearing. The automatic door slid closed behind my mother, and for a moment I stood there, watching her walk away with her bags balanced in her arms. She didn't look back. Neither did I. The conversation hadn't ended neatly, but it had ended honestly, and that was more than I'd ever had before. I stayed where I was for a few seconds longer, letting the noise of the store settle around me again. Carts rolled past. A cashier laughed quietly with a customer. Somewhere near the bakery, warm air carried the smell of bread. The world hadn't shifted on its axis. It didn't need to. The shift had already happened inside me. For years, I'd imagined that a moment like this would end with an apology, with tears, with my mother finally saying she was proud of me. Standing there now, I realized I wasn't waiting for that anymore. Wanting closure from someone who had benefited from misunderstanding me would have only pulled me back into the same old position. I didn't need her validation to stand upright in my own life. I walked slowly through the store, past the aisles she'd judged so confidently just minutes earlier. Everything looked the same as it always had. The labels, the lighting, the careful order. But I felt lighter moving through it, as if I'd set down something heavy I hadn't realized I was carrying. Employees nodded as I passed, the same quiet respect they always offered. There was no fanfare, no special treatment, and I liked it that way. I belonged here without needing to announce it, without needing anyone to clap or gasp or change their opinion of me. As I headed toward the back offices, my mother's word echoed once more in my mind. Poor. I turned it over, examining it the way you examine something that once hurt you, just to be sure it doesn't anymore. She had never meant money. Not really. She had meant invisible, unimpressive, unwilling to perform success in a way that made her comfortable. She had mistaken humility for failure, privacy for lack, silence for weakness. I had never been poor. I had simply chosen not to prove myself to someone who measured worth by surface shine. The quiet victory of that realization settled deep in my chest. I hadn't humiliated her. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't demanded anything from her at all. I had stood still, told the truth, and refused to be diminished any further. That was enough. I didn't follow her outside. I didn't watch to see if she turned back. Some chapters don't need to be reread to be closed. Later that evening, as I locked up and the store lights dimmed one by one, I thought about how many people live their lives under the weight of someone else's expectations. How many daughters and sons and quiet siblings are told, in ways both obvious and subtle, that they're not enough, that their value depends on applause, money, or fitting into a role they never chose. If that's you, I want you to hear this. You don't need a dramatic reveal to claim your dignity. You don't need to outshine anyone to deserve respect. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining yourself and start setting boundaries. And if you've ever been the person on the other side, the one who used comparison or jokes or motivation to stay on top, maybe it's worth asking yourself what you're afraid of losing if you stop measuring people that way. Stories like this don't end when the confrontation is over. They end when someone decides to live differently afterward. For me, that meant walking away whole, not waiting for permission to be at peace. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own family dynamics or moments where you were underestimated, I'd love to hear about it. Share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. You never know who might read them and feel less alone. And if you want to stay with this channel for more stories about quiet justice, family drama, and reclaiming self-worth without shouting, consider liking this video and subscribing. Your support helps keep these voices heard, especially the ones that were overlooked for far too long. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.